Good evening, everyone, especially those of you who are joining us virtually in what is the second of 3 forums that the Concord Museum has organized to help mark the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, the culmination of a decades-long movement for women's suffrage at both state and national levels. I'm Tom Putnam, the director of the Concord Museum, and we've opted in our series to look at some of the less well-known stories of female crusaders in Boston and in Concord, whose efforts were precursors to the suffrage movement and part of it. And I invite you to join us next week when Laura Walls discusses the women of the Thoreau family. That's next Thursday, August 20th. And I'd also like to note that we very happily reopened our museum last week. Our galleries are now reopened. And we've been able to extend our current temporary exhibit on Paul Revere, which includes a handwritten manuscript of Longfellow's famous poem about the Midnight Ride. So we're pleased that Nicholas Basbanes will speak on Tuesday, August 25th, about his new biography of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Cross of Snow, which I've been reading and quite enjoying. So I hope you'll join us for that. And I remind everyone that we'll have our conversation for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll take your questions, and you can send those in via the chat feature. And then my colleague, Allison, will get them to me, so I will ask your questions to our 2 guest speakers tonight. As you know, tonight's forum's focus is on 2 crusading daughters of Boston and Concord, Carolyn Healy Dahl and Mary Merrick Brooks, among others. And we're so pleased to have with us 2 crusading scholars who are expert on these women and their times. Helen Deese is the Carolyn Healy Dahl editor for the Massachusetts Historical Society and a professor of English Emerita at Tennessee Technological University. She lives in Flint and Ann Arbor, Michigan. Her books include Robert Lowell, essays on the poetry, and a Daughter of Boston, as well as volumes in the selected journals of Carolyn Healy Dahl. Sandra Petrolinas is Distinguished Professor of English and American Studies at Pennsylvania State University at Altoona, and the author of To Set This World Right, The Anti-Slavery Movement in Thoreau's Concord. She's also one of the co-editors of a scholarly digital edition of the Almanacs of Mary Moody Emerson. So Sandy and Helen, we thank you so much for joining us tonight and our audience here in Concord. We meet obviously on a historic night where our country has perhaps inched closer to a woman serving in one of our nation's highest office. Of course, 2 women have been previously nominated to serve as vice president, but on unsuccessful tickets, so we shall see. I want to keep the focus primarily on women tonight, but I came across a lovely phrase written by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a contemporary of both Mary Merrick Brooks and Carolyn Healy Dahl, in which he referenced what he called, quote, a sisterhood of reforms, where he labeled the abolition of slavery as the highest priority, with women's rights not far behind. And I think part of what we'll be discussing tonight is the intersection and perhaps conflict between and within those 2 movements. And I thought the best place to begin would be having our scholars introduce the 2 principles that we've highlighted in the title of tonight's presentation, Carolyn Healy Dahl and Mary Merrick Brooks. Our audience may be more familiar with Mary Merrick Brooks because Sandy has spoken here before about her. And again, Brooks is centered here in Concord. So I thought we'd actually start with you, Helen, and maybe just give us a general introduction if folks don't know who Carolyn Healy Dahl was and why she's so important to this period in history. So Helen.
Okay, but first time I must disclaim having written a book on Robert Lowell. There is another Helen Deese.
Oh, okay.
Who's a literary scholar, but that is not, I am not that person.
All right, sorry about that.
Caroline Healy Dahl was born in 1822 in Boston into a wealthy family. She grew up at a very exciting time to be living in Boston. It was the heyday of the Transcendentalists. So when Emerson delivered his very first series of lectures in Boston in the winter of 1835, there was a 12-year-old child in the audience. That was Caroline Healy, whose father had paid her the great compliment, I think, of buying her a ticket. to listen to Emerson lecture. As a young woman, she was also mentored by Elizabeth Peabody, a transcendentalist educator and businesswoman, owner of an important bookstore. And she participated in conversations led by the great transcendentalist feminist Margaret Fuller. Her father lost his money after the Panic of 1837, and or Healy, as she was then, immediately started looking for work, and she found a job as a teacher in Georgetown in the District of Columbia. So she went to work and sent all her money back for her siblings' education. She met there a Unitarian minister, Charles Dahl, and they married. After 11 years, he became a missionary to Calcutta. And she was left as more or less a single mother. She participated in the abolitionist movement and was a major figure early on in the women's movement. The last part of her life, she spent the last 34 years in Washington, D.C., where her son was a prominent scientist. And she was the friend of First Lady Frances Cleveland and senators and congressmen and their wives. And she sometimes taught classes for young women in the tradition of Margaret Fuller. So that's a brief overview of her life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Sandy, why don't you do the same for Mary Merrick Brooks?
Sure. Mary Merrick was born in Concord in 1801, so she's a senior to Caroline Healy Dahl, and she spent her whole life in Concord, the daughter of Sally Minot and Tilly Merrick. And all of her youthful letters are just filled with sort of typical young woman fashion, school friends, young men, boyfriends, different people they're trying to catch the eye of, just very much a social butterfly with none of the, I love them because they are such a contrast to the later letters of this driven abolitionist, really crusading person. I'm so glad you've used that word, Tom, to describe her. Edward Jarvis, an early historian of Concord, describes her as the most beautiful young woman in town. We have only one image of her as a middle-aged woman, and it's right there in the Concord Museum. So hopefully folks will take a look at that and recognize her a little bit better next time they visit you. At age 22, she married a local Concord man, a widower, Nathan Brooks, who was very much her senior, 16 years older. He had a daughter, and then they had a son together. So she was a wife and mother for all of her adult life. She was involved in the temperance movement, the Concord Charitable Society, so female charitable society. So reform was always a part of her young adult years. But nothing sparked her like the call of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist in Boston, to join, insisting that women join the abolitionist movement. So I know we'll talk about that more as we go on, but it's certainly important to see her as a young woman already active in the county leadership of the county abolitionist organization before there's a local female anti-slavery society in Concord. Everyone who left remarks about Mary Brooks describes her as a zealot, a fanatic, a driven personality, someone who is pushy, persistent, all of those things that we get no indication of, again, at all in her young letters. In 1850, she did join the very prominent and public and popular call for the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester. There, I would assume she might have encountered Caroline Dahl or at some other associated conventions like that, but her letters don't say anything about women's rights. They are all filled with either personal details or the anti-slavery cause and her religious motivation for that sense of fervor. So unfortunately, we don't have a sense other than her name on that one call for that one convention of how she really felt as a woman. About that particular movement that was in parallel with the anti-slavery effort.
Helen, why don't you talk just a little bit more about Caroline's youth, her relationship with her father, how she became as educated, but also there was some disappointment in terms of her relationship with her father.
Yes, her father was the single most important person in her life, I believe. Um, he gave her a good private education. She was the oldest child, and he treated her as he might have treated a son. He discussed and debated questions of religion and politics and history with her, helping her to develop and defend her own opinions. But his expectations of her were unreasonably high. As a young teenager, she knew 4 languages. She had written several unpublished novels. And since the age of 13, she had been contributing articles to the Unitarian paper in Boston, the Christian Register. And in the midst of all this, her father told her that she had disappointed his expectations. Exactly what his expectations were, I don't know, and Caroline didn't know, and I'm not sure he knew. But she felt very, very pushed by him, and she was constantly trying to satisfy him. After the beginning of her involvement with anti-slavery, they clashed. At a time when she was desperate for financial help, this is when after she's married and has children, she asked him for $100, and he refused unless she ceased all connection with the abolitionists. He told her that this work that the abolitionists were doing, that she was doing, was the worst sin that she could commit. But he had taught her to think for herself, and she refused to relent. So her father was both the goad to her ambition and the opponent against whom she would hone her character by resisting. Years after his death, she wrote in her journal, "I hope that my father, wherever he is, knows that human slavery is a sin."
We'll go back to that, both the journals and her relationship with her father in a minute. But why don't we switch to Sandy? And how about Nathan Brooks? Was he supportive of his wife's crusading spirit, and was he in favor of abolitionism, or was he, like Carolyn Healy's doll, more reticent?
He was much more supportive, but still not nearly to the extreme levels that his wife went. He was a lawyer. He was a respected town leader in Concord, has been described as being one of the ruling families of Concord. And he was a state senator for a while too. I forget if he served 1 or 2 terms. So he was very much a Whig politician and a moderate anti-slavery figure, never at all aligned with the Garrison wing. In fact, in I think it was 1840, he was running for a congressional seat, which he lost. And at the same time that Mary had been forging relationships with the Boston abolitionists, including Garrison, her husband was being denounced in very strong terms in the same newspaper, The Liberator, because they didn't feel that his views were strong enough on the subject of slavery. As a visiting abolitionist reported back to a friend when she visited the Brooks and met Nathan, she said, "He's as good an abolitionist as his social standing will permit." And that accorded quite well. Actually, a friend and neighbor, Ann Bigelow from Concord, later reported much the same thing, only she included Waldo Emerson. She said that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Mr. Brooks were always afraid of committal. We women never. They had to obey the law. And that was something I didn't really fully appreciate when I first read that letter. And it was said in retrospect, Ann Bigelow was quite an old woman being interviewed and reflecting on the abolitionist days. But that really did, I think, spark them. And I'm sure it was the same for Dahl to some extent, that they were operating under the radar of what was really expected or legal to some extent for women's activism. And so I think they pushed that for all it was worth. Mary only left, that I've been able to find, 1 comment about what her husband thought of her activism. In a letter, she is trying to get Waldo Emerson to sign a disunion petition. So a very far left kind of petition in the first place. And she's reporting in the letter the various men to whom she's been around in town to get to sign it, and reporting why none of them would. And then she comes to her husband and she says, Mr. Brooks treats it with contempt. His wife, a very silly woman to have anything. So you have to imagine that occasionally at home the sparks were flying, but their daughter went to conventions with her. Caroline went with her, with Mary Brooks, to the first anti-slavery convention of American women in Philadelphia, which was very famous for the destruction of the newly built Pennsylvania Convention Hall when the anti-abolition mobs objected. So her daughter was certainly very much a part of the radicalism, if you will. It was a happy marriage to everything we know. Affectionate letters, he had pet names for his wife, and seemed to really dote on her. So whatever their political differences on that subject, it didn't seem to be, really something of note as far as their relationship was concerned.
And Sandy, just for fun, tell the story about Mary Merrick Brooks's the comment she made to her son after her son got into a little trouble at college. Yeah,
word had come back to her that George, their son, had been drinking alcohol. And there are very moving letters back and forth with George apologizing to his mother for having done such a thing. And he'd taken the temperance pledge and was promising never to do it again. And she was not going to let him off the hook. And it's just really awful. She says to him, I wish I had strangled you in your cradle when you were a baby rather than live to have such opprobrium. It gave me I came across that letter, and I have to say that some of my admiration, or at least my understanding of that zealotry.
You certainly wouldn't want to tangle with her, that's for sure.
Yeah. I'm afraid my daughter would not have appreciated such a comment.
So Helen, you referenced the journals, and that's what you've spent so much of your scholarship on. Just describe to the audience, if they don't know, just what an incredible resource Caroline Healy Doll's journals are.
Well, she began keeping a journal at age 9. The very earliest journals don't survive, but we have them from age 15, almost to her death at age 90. And so almost 75 years. It's the longest running diary that I am aware of anywhere. And certainly her journals constitute the fullest account of the life of a 19th century American woman. She recorded all sorts of public events, lectures, public gatherings, political events, sermons, the Civil War, an inside view of the transcendentalist, abolitionist, and women's rights movements. In fact, wherever she is throughout her life, she often is in the middle of major events and movements, and all of this she records in her journals. But the journals are not simply an account of great people and public events. They also tell the compelling private story of Caroline Doll, her ups and downs, her ambitions, her challenges, the stresses of being more or less an abandoned wife and a single mother. The transcendentalist educator, Elizabeth Peabody, urged her as a young woman. She said, you need to write a journal of thought, stripped of all feeling. But Caroline Healy, who was 18 at the time, resisted. And she knew even then that a major function of the journal was an emotional release for herself. So what we have is a journal of feeling, as well as a journal that chronicles events, and also very much a journal of thought, in which Doll is trying to work out her place in the scheme of things.
And Sandy, you don't have that benefit for Mary Merrick Brooks, but what do you rely on, or what has your research relied on in terms of understanding her and her voice?
Oh, I still have that deep wish that someday in Concord, someone's going to call me and say, I've got this diary. I think maybe you'll be interested. But we rely almost exclusively on her own letters. And largely these are found in 3 collections of major figures: Wendell Phillips, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then also the Weston sisters, a group of 4 anti-slavery women in Boston. And so it's the letters that Mary wrote to them that give us most of the information for the specific activities, as well as her sense of emotional involvement and leadership. It gives us a great window on her just really instinctive knack for networking, identifying the powerful figures, the power brokers of the movement, and then knowing that she needs to bring her influence and the women's influence to them. Certainly there are other letters. There are a couple of letters in the Adams family papers, because she wrote to John Quincy Adams twice when she was upset about Cherokee removal in 1838. And there are several letters in the Concord Library, again, primarily as a young woman. So mainly the letters are the 1840s, a few in the 1850s. And they just reveal lengthily her charm, her willingness to use an entire arsenal of tactics to bring her, to get important people to Concord. She wasn't interested in the B level. She wanted the A level. Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison. It's thanks to her that Frederick Douglass spoke in Concord for the first time in 1841. And she's not at all beyond using what I would call sort of female self-deprecation. Help us on account of us being poor, low women. But over and over and over again, I call it apologetic importunity. She is a total pain, but she doesn't care, because the cause is what's foremost. And she just keeps putting the cause first and then apologizing second.
And did she keep her incoming correspondence? And is that anywhere, or is it, I mean, obviously you want to hear her voice, so it's the outgoing, but was she a good archivist herself, or no?
No. If she was, they're not in the Nathan Brooks family papers, at least, where you would expect those to have been deposited. I think I have 2 or 3 letters where abolitionists are writing to each other about her. And so that does document and confirm, what she's doing. It adds another window to what they thought of her. She wrote a couple of articles in the Liberator as well. William Lloyd Garrison acknowledged her work there. So we do have some external confirmation of what she's talking about in the letters, but we don't have the other side of the correspondence, at least not yet.
Okay. So Sandy gave us a nice segue, Helen, mentioning Frederick Douglass, and I thought, having read the book and heard you speak before, to maybe give a flavor of the journal entries, and also, and perhaps you'll provide the context, this relationship with her father and the abolitionist issue. Perhaps you could read an excerpt from that journal entry when Carolyn Haley-Dahl hears Frederick Douglass speak for the first time.
Yes, yes. The meeting that she's describing here is one of the first such major anti-slavery conventions that she's ever attended, and it is marked by the first time she hears Frederick Douglass. It's May the 30th, 1849. I found it raining heavily, and under the shelter of Aunt Anne's umbrella, I went down to the meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society, where I stayed all the morning through the heavy storm. I was glad I went, for I heard fine speaking from Wendell Phillips, Foster and his wife, Frederick Douglass, and Remond. In this speaking, there was nothing fanatical, nothing severe. It was creditable to the Christianity of the speakers. Douglass, in eloquence, argument, and force of will, a much neglected but very important part of public speaking, far surpassed them all. So you see that she is she's reassuring herself, because of what her father thinks about abolitionism, that there's nothing, too radical here. It's Christian. And the next day she continues, the meetings continue the next day, Thursday, May 31st, 1849. I sewed and taught Willie until it was time to attend the anti-slavery meeting. It was intensely exciting, and chiefly because after Stephen Foster had made one of his most disagreeable and repulsive speeches, Douglass rose and vindicated his own Christianity and that of true reform in one of the finest that ever fell from the lips of man. God bless Frederick Douglass. God bless him and his cause. So prayed I while he spoke, so pray I now. During the violent address of Foster, too weak in soul and body to rise myself, I was inwardly praying that God would raise up an apostle to speak against such folly. He was followed by Charles Burleigh in a noble speech, but one of those quite likely to be misinterpreted. I prayed again with a broken spirit, for I felt this was not what was needed. But after Douglas had risen, I sang, and my song was an anthem of praise. I could not restrain my enthusiasm. He seemed to me while he spoke greater than any man to whom I had ever listened. And the moment the meeting was closed, I went up on the stage and thanked him in person. What would Father have said had he seen me then? No matter. God knows I was in the way of my duty, and with an undivided heart, I asked no questions then. May I never in the future. So this is what I love about her journals, is you get this interweaving of the public event and its effect on her, how it plays out in her life. So here she's reporting on history. I mean, this becomes history, but at the same time, she's depicting this watershed moment in her own consciousness, moment when she's not only overwhelmed by Douglas's eloquence and the righteousness of the cause and the greatness of the man, Frederick Douglass, but she is consciously rejecting her father's dominion and opting for duty instead. It's a very defining and characteristic moment for her.
Sandy, let's switch to Concord and just both Mary Merrick Brooks, but the women of Concord. I mean, they really, well, I won't put words in your mouth, the role that women played in the anti-slavery movement in Concord and how that developed and why it was so important.
They really, women led anything and everything really that was done as what you would call a radical abolitionist movement in Concord. They were always supported by, I would say, a half dozen very loyal men, Sam Barrett, Tim Prescott, others who were there with them, William Whiting, willing to do what they needed, but really looking to the women. The reversal of leadership was from the get-go, the way that the anti-slavery movement went. And again, I think it's because, as much as anything, the women had the time to do this. And so they did it. And when they realized that they could expand on their routine charity work to anti-slavery and add a political identity to what they were already used to doing, they were good organizers, they were good networkers, they knew the community, then that was just a natural addition in their work. William Lloyd Garrison was brilliant in always insisting that women take the leadership of the movement, their moral imperative, their moral duty. And through that, then they took and developed a moral authority. And it was very much a crusade. Mary Merrick Brooks felt, especially as many of the Concord residents did, male and female, that Concord had a special role to play because of its revolutionary heritage. And so again, it wasn't all right to have the B-level speakers. Concord deserved to be at the top of the leadership. She had a very competitive edge, many of these women did, and they were all raising money, holding bazaars, fairs, other fundraisers, so that they could contribute their money to the state anti-slavery society and help Garrison actually publish The Liberator and pay for all of these speakers to speak all around the state and the region. And the donations, the contributions of the different women's organizations were published in The Liberator quarterly. And so they knew that Concord women and how much they contributed was going to be seen. And they wanted to raise more than Hingham or Dedham or any of these other towns. Mary Merrick Brooks and also Henry Thoreau's sisters, Helen and Sophia, were active in the county anti-slavery society from its founding in 34 and 35. But in 1837, the female anti-slavery society formed as a direct result of Angelina and Sarah Grimke's having been there in September to speak for about 4 days. And after that, Lydian, Jackson, Emerson, and others determined that Concord needed to have its own society. Apparently, the founding meeting was held in October and had about 60 members, but I have never seen a roster that contained more than about 20 names, the vast majority of those being female. Every woman in Henry Thoreau's household, 4 aunts, 2 permanent boarders, a mother, and 2 sisters were members, founding members of the society. Ralph Waldo Emerson's wife and his visiting aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, as well, when she was in town. So these 2 men who have connected Concord with what we call the hotbed of abolitionism were driven to this and had no way to escape it ultimately. Mary Merrick Brooks traded very much on the proximity to Boston. And so it was an easy matter for these major speakers to come to Concord to speak. And she regarded herself and molded herself as a lieutenant of the woman in charge of the Boston Female Society, Maria Weston Chapman. And so it was through that relationship and viewing herself as the prime mover and all that needed to be done that we really need to look at the movement's evolution. From the beginning, for Mary Merrick Brooks, there was no one more important than Ralph Waldo Emerson. His reputation, his stature, his international standing, these were all important to her. And so she went after him from the beginning. And
what
finally,
was their relationship like?
It was neighborly. He always speaks of Mrs. Brooks being the reason he's writing to a certain person, or Mrs. Brooks has brought it to my attention that such and such is the case, and therefore I'm probably shouldn't speak at the New Bedford Lyceum because I understand they now have segregated seating for African Americans. So he respected her. I think he must have been very, very tired of her and weary of her, I think, no doubt. But certainly when he came out to speak in 1844 for West Indian emancipation at an event organized by the Female Anti-Slavery Society, she absolutely was thrilled. That also publicly aligned him, in her view, with the radicalism of Garrison's movement. And so she just kept it up. Petition after petition, letter after letter, never really letting up on him.
I thought I would just quip that things don't change in Concord, that my board only allows me to invite A-list speakers, so that's why
it started early. Good.
You said something earlier, Sandy, that Helen, I know in reading the introduction to the journals, you comment on this too. I mean, in some ways, maybe there was a certain freedom they had because, again, for Mary Merrick Brooks, she had a little less to lose than, say, her husband, whose social standing in his business or his political career. And Helen, you talk about how when Caroline is no longer a minister's wife, there's again a certain freedom to take these stances. So maybe comment on that. But then I also feel like we may be painting too rosy a picture. I mean, there certainly were challenges and hurdles, and there must have been some self-doubt and naysayers. So anyway, maybe you could just talk about their ability to do this work and the challenges that they face. But Helen, why don't you start?
Okay, yes. After her husband left, actually she's a C for quite a while, trying to figure out what she's here for. And there is some reason she's here. She's sure of that. And she's also sure that she is very special, that she calls it, why has God gifted me so strangely if there's not something for me to do, And she gradually comes to discover she gets more and more involved in the abolitionist movement, but her niche then becomes the women's movement.
Yeah.
And she is very involved in that very early on. She helps edit the first women's publication, a periodical publication, the Una. And, you know, she gets, some of this stuff she gets paid $5 or $10 at a time for, but it is not a way to make a living. It is not a way to make a living. And it's a way to make a lot of enemies. None of her family approved of it. Her father's family, none of them approved of it. Although her father did come to her lectures when she began lecturing. But her sisters are embarrassed to have a woman who's a sister who's a woman's rights woman. So, you know, there were trade-offs, but that never, sort of like Mary Brooks, that cut no ice whatsoever, that she had opposition. In fact, it probably did the opposite. It just made her all the more determined.
And then I'm jumping ahead because we're running out of time. I should mention again, we welcome questions. So if people have questions, please begin to send them in via chat. But then she actually gets a little bit divorced from the women's movement. Maybe Helen, you can just briefly tell us how
yes.
she's a leader and then she somehow gets cut out.
Right. Yes, she is early on. She publishes a major book in 1867 called The College, the Market, and the Court. And at that moment, I think she is the most important woman's right person in the country. Anthony Trollope, the English novelist, comes to America and stays a year and writes about it. And she is the woman's rights person that he uses as an example. But after the war, when women are, you know, they thought they were on the verge of getting the vote right then. And it didn't happen. And the New York contingent of the movement, which was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they weren't willing for Blacks to get the franchise if women did not.
Right.
Caroline Dahl never felt that way. She wanted Black people to get the franchise. She did not oppose that, even though she knew that women were not going to get it. But she was ideologically far apart from the New York people. But there had grown up by this time a group in Boston too. Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Caroline Severance, others. So much more ideologically similar to Dahl. But these people were also the people who started the New England Women's Club in 1868. Dahl went to the first meeting of it only to discover that she was blackballed from membership in the organization. And she was astounded and never recovered really from it. Why did they do this? We're not sure. Probably some jealousy. People told her it's because you're too smart, you know, they don't, and you lead everywhere you go. Probably there was some jealousy, but also she was a very difficult person to get along with. She didn't know what tact was, and she left a string of broken relationships throughout her life. And so at that point, she sort of separates herself from the organized women's movement and goes on to start a new organization called the American Social Science Association, which has a broader reform agenda, scientific ways of attacking all of society's ills. She's a founder of it, along with Frank Sanborn, by the way, Concordian. And she, one of her main agendas is to have an organization that women can be equal in the leadership of. So she's one of the reasons that organization existed and was a leader in it for decades. So she comes to be identified with it then instead of the women's movement.
Right, yeah. Sandy, I know you mentioned that we don't know too much about Mary Merrick Brooks and the women's movement, but Helen just mentioned the war, the Civil War, and she also mentioned the year 1868 in another context, but that's the year that Mary Merrick Brooks dies. But do we know much about, does she write at all about, the war and the Emancipation Proclamation, and or at the end of her life, and we just assume that she is pleased with the progress that's been made? But
We have, I think, so far I've located about 3 letters from the 1860s, all post-war. Her husband's quite ill during these years, and so presumably she's not writing nearly as much, caring for him. We do have a letter, I think, right around the time that Garrison is about to close the Liberator, and she's telling him not to do so, and writing to Wendell Phillips as well, that until freedmen are really freed, she says so-called freedmen, because she understands, as many did, that they had not yet achieved equality simply because they were no longer enslaved. And so she's asking Garrison to keep the paper going. It's the light that we need, she said, as the struggle must continue. And then, I mean, that's it. We have 3 letters. I think there's one in 1866 responding to Phillips, who is asking her if he can put her name on a petition that he's formulating for freed people, and raising money for them. And she's happy to say yes to that. She's also upset that Lydia Emerson has taken him as her guest after his most recent speech in Concord, because she thought it was her turn to be the entertainer. So she's chiding, in a letter to Phillips, she's chiding Mrs. Emerson. And she does that pretty often.
This might
but
be
that's it. No
nice
views about the war.
Moment for you just to, I had suggested you might read a few sentences of Phillips' eulogy when she does pass away, because they're such beautiful words that seem to capture her spirit.
She died in 1868, and he had written similar comments about her earlier, her influence in his view on Ralph Waldo Emerson especially. But at her funeral, he said the following, that when more than 30 years ago I joined the anti-slavery movement, one of the first places I visited was Concord. Mrs. Brooks welcomed me to the old town. She was one, and a chief one, of half a dozen royal-minded women who represented the anti-slavery purpose of the place. The famous men who lived there turned only a tolerant eye to the cause. They showed their faces now and then at meetings, but it was these untiring women that brought these noted names of Concord into sympathy with this great uprising for justice. Frank almost to bluntness, she never shrunk from speaking her whole thought. In the emergency of a great crisis, she could see and rebuke the shortcomings of those she loved best. There she sounds a lot like Dahl. And then these two sentences in the eulogy, and they're just beautiful. Her life was a marked instance of how much decision of character affects. We call others self-sacrificing and devoted, but she and her associates lived for their reform ideas. I'm sorry that it's at her death, but she would have been thrilled to hear those words out of a man she really, really had on quite a pedestal. But maybe she heard them.
And again, we stated earlier that Brooks was born before Dahl, and Dahl lived almost an additional 50 years. And Sandy, just talk, you mentioned your book, second generation of female leaders in Concord after Brooks, including Louisa May Alcott and Ellen Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's daughters. Just give us just a brief synopsis of the role that those women played.
By the time the decade of the 1850s rolled around, we were very much into a second generation of abolitionists. And so Ellen Emerson and Louisa May Alcott are great examples of that. The Alcotts moved back to Concord in 1857. Both of their mothers had been, again, founding members of the Female Anti-Slavery Society, very much shared Garrison's view of pacifism and nonviolence in the anti-slavery struggle. And by the time the 1850s and the fugitive slave law had been passed and the increasing violence out in the Kansas territory, these two girls and many other abolitionists were much more willing to concede that violence might be necessary, whether self-defense in arming and helping their formerly enslaved Black neighbors, or in other regards. So Louisa May put her talents to work writing dramatic, amateur theatricals, dramatic pieces, and the young people in Concord acted these out at anti-slavery events and raised money for the society. Ellen talks in her letters about her excitement of sewing circles as the women gathered at the Emerson home to make clothes to send to the abolitionist settlers in Kansas. Both of them were very, very strong in supporting John Brown, as nearly all of the abolitionists, not all of them, but most of them in Concord were. And I think it's pretty telling that these very young women, Alcott's nearly 30 by this time, but Ellen's a teenager, that they both viewed civil war as really inevitable if slavery was to come to an end. Their mothers would never have been willing to say such a thing 20 years earlier when they started their activism.
Right. Someone mentioned I a little garbled, or can you both hear me okay?
You're garbled, but I hear you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It maybe in a moment I can, I may have to reconnect, but so you both write, there's usually words in both of your books about kind of a sense either of gender consciousness or, again, Sandy, you have a letter written by someone else, the consciousness of personal responsibility that an individual might feel when they're confronted with a moral wrong, and the consciousness of power to do something about it, which, I mean, these are contemporary challenges that we all face too. But first, maybe focus on that word consciousness. For both of these women, where do you think that sense of consciousness came from that really drove them to be the people that they were? So Helen, why don't you begin?
Well, I think Dahl's transcendentalist background has a lot to do with it. Listening to Emerson, being in Margaret Fuller's conversation group, Margaret Fuller being, essentially the first great American feminist. And certainly those seeds would have been planted in a very fertile soil for Dahl, because she was, from a very early age, well aware that there were these disabilities. The young men that she went to church with went to Harvard and had use of the library and could preach in pulpits, which there's no doubt in my mind that if she had been male, she would have been a minister. So she is these things are in her mind from the beginning. Then she sits at the feet of Margaret Fuller and she reads Woman in the 19th Century. And there's no mystery as to how she comes to the conclusion that things need changing. And combined with that, the fact that she feels this giftedness we talked about. And I think what she meant by that was she knew she had an extraordinary ability to think, speak, and write. And she knew there must have been some reason for that she was given that. And when she puts that together with the women's cause, she feels that she has found her place in the scheme of things.
Sandy, how about Mary Merrick Brooks?
You're making me wish all the more that we had that journal or diary, and I have no evidence that she kept one, but that sort of self-consciousness is, of course, not apparent usually in letters that you're writing. Now, in her letters to Maria Weston Chapman, when she's writing to another woman whom she very much models herself after and whom she regards as an equal in a shared struggle, then you get some snippets of, I don't know what is to set this world right. I want great names for the cause. I want to do great things. She's an impatient Christian martyr and not always so Christian. She says there are times that she's worried she's becoming an atheist of all things because she's not patient enough. but the consciousness of power was never, of responsibility, never seems to have been something she ever questioned. And that seems to come from the essence of the morality of the cause itself, whether that's also greatly enabled, and I think it was, by William Lloyd Garrison's insistence, and other male abolitionists, particularly Nathaniel Rogers, another newspaper man from New Hampshire, totally said that the women were the ones responsible for driving this crusade. But once she had that responsibility underway, I think the power derived from one success at a time. As she did gain influence, as Ralph Waldo Emerson, as early as 1838, did write to President Van Buren in a published letter about the Cherokee removal, thanks to her goading. You know, one step at a time, Wendell Phillips comes back to speak for the third time because she invited him. Then I think the power just grew, and she was instinctively desirous of power and very sophisticated and shrewd in the way that she really mobilized it and got other people to do what she wanted them to do. Unfortunately, I have no indication of her reading of anything like Fuller or even the Transcendentalists. She doesn't say anything about Emerson's writings, except when in letters she's saying, Emerson, you believe in moral principalities, and when you see a thing to be right, you want it to be done. You then should sign my petition. So that's the only indication that she knows she's living with a transcendentalist, is that she uses what he said to get him to do what she thinks he should.
Sandy, that phrase that you use in your, well, from Brooks, that you use in your book to set the, as the title, to set the world right. Yeah. I mean, that is Dahl in a nutshell too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And I don't know that they ever met, Helen.
I don't know, no. Now, Dahl lectured in Concord in 1859 on the women's rights question.
Mary has to have been there, surely.
Surely. About 400 were there, she said.
I mean, even Henry Thoreau went and liked her. So
he did go. And Ellen Emerson, this was her favorite compliment. Ellen Emerson, someone asked her how she liked it, and she said, well, I usually sleep through lectures, but I didn't miss a word of this one. She was so much in earnest.
Wow. And she would have been young, maybe 10 years old or something then?
She was 18. She was
okay.
She was 59.
But Ellen, she would have been young.
No, she was Ellen who, 59. Wouldn't that make her about 18?
59, I'm sorry. I thought you said 49. Okay, okay.
So we have some questions from the audience, and we'll continue to take more as time allows. So first, the first question is a question about who were the African-American or the Black women or men who worked with Mary Merrick Brooks here in Concord, and then did Carolyn Healy Dahl have associates who were African-American? Maybe Sandy first here in Concord.
The family that we know attended and hosted one meeting is Jack and Susan Garrison. And in fact, if you're familiar with them or not, you can learn a great deal of their history at the Robbins House in Concord, which has been moved and is now located across the street from the North Bridge Park. Their daughter Susan and their daughter Ellen were probably also at those early meetings because they were old enough to have attended. And Ellen and Susan the mother all signed the Cherokee anti-removal petition that the women from Concord submitted in 1838. So I feel pretty sure that along with Susan the mother, those two daughters were probably at some of those early meetings in 1837. I don't have any other evidence in the letters or any other documents that the Hutchinson or the Dugan families, those African-American families, were at any of the meetings. They may well have been, but the Garrisons are the families where we do have the documents that put them not only attending the meetings, but actually hosting one in December 1837.
Nice. Helen, for Carolyn Healy Dahl.
Harriet Tubman, she was acquainted with Harriet Tubman, and they were on the stage at one point together. That was a women's rights movement, and I can't tell you the date on that. As the women's movement You know, I can't think of that many African Americans at this point who were involved. Frederick Douglass was, for sure. And Harriet Tubman. Those are about the only ones I can think of at the moment.
So someone's asked a question for you about, you mentioned the lecture she gave here in Concord. Did Carolyn Healy Dahl give a lot of lectures?
Yes,
mostly
she
here
did.
in Massachusetts, or did she travel around like others? Or
She traveled in New England. She developed four series of annual lectures, each one with 4 lectures. So that was 16 lectures that she delivered in Boston first. And then she would deliver part or all of those elsewhere. She delivered almost all of those in Worcester too. Worcester was a place where she had many fans. And this was the only one though she delivered in Concord. She talked about Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft in that lecture. But she lectured in Maine, nearly froze to death. The rigors of lecturing in the winter were many.
Let me ask, always good to have a little hint of scandal. So John Burns is asking a question to you, Helen, that Dahl had a relationship with a young male minister in Medford. Could that have been the cause of her being blackballed from the New England's Women's Club? And I know you write about parts of her journal. She writes about affection or relationships she has with men who aren't her husbands and the challenges that that causes. So, but I don't want to ignore John's question about whether the relationship with the minister in Medford might have hurt her cause.
Goodness. It's possible. No doubt there must have been gossip about that, which Dahl was much his senior in years. And even though she was totally emotionally invested in him, this man's name was Edward Towne. She was very emotionally invested in him. This was not a physical relationship. And it turned out very badly. This man was very unstable, unbalanced, erratic, and he became a terrible enemy of hers when the whole thing fell apart. So no doubt he spread who knows what about her. And it could be, John, it could be part of why she was blackballed.
Okay, so there's 2 last questions, and they're more general. So the first is simply how you both found, what drew you to these subjects? You know, how did you find your way to these 2 remarkable women in your own scholarship? So Sandy, why don't you begin with your work here in Concord?
I was writing, I thought, a book about Henry Thoreau's contributions to the anti-slavery movement. And while that is still a part of the book I ended up writing, I soon discovered that his role was pretty minimal and that these women were the story. I thank Bob Hudspeth for that. Some of you may know Bob as the scholar and consummate editor of Thoreau's letters and Margaret Fuller's letters. When I first met with him, he said, look into the women's letters. If anybody was doing anything and recording it, these women had time to write it up in their journals and letters. And so, you know, see what was going on in that correspondence. And I still thought I was reading the correspondence to find out what Henry was doing. And pretty soon Henry just wasn't all that much an important player. He wasn't all that interesting. And it was much more of a recovery project. And of course, that was, since I'd been trained in textual editing and documentary and manuscript work, that was a thrill to find all of these letters that not only no one had cared to read very much, but that were like puzzles to figure out the coded biblical verses they were talking about. What did that mean? Their handwriting was terrible. So once you get hooked on text itself and then find an exciting figure like Dahl or like Mary Merrick Brooks, or now for me, Mary Moody Emerson, you can't let go.
I mean, the image of a biblical scholar, Helen, seems to fit that your Bible are these journals. You probably spend more time than anyone interpreting them.
Oh, my goodness.
How did you end up there?
Well, very similar to Sandy, I was originally looking at Dahl as a window on the big name transcendentalists. And and gradually, like Sandy, I came to see that Dahl herself was exceedingly worthy of attention. I was nosing around in the Massachusetts Historical Society, where a huge cache of her papers is. And the new editor of publications, Conrad Wright, approached me and he said, I hear you're interested in Caroline Dahl. The MHS publishes this series collections from the Massachusetts Historical Society. We've been publishing it for some 200 years, and we think it's about time we did the Papers of a Woman, he said. So he asked if I would be interested in it, in doing the editing. And so Conrad Wright is now retired. So I have pursued this through his whole career at Mass Historical and more, and still working.
So we have a contemporary question and a nice one to end on. So the questioner asks, could each of you give a quick comment on one aspect of these remarkable women that could motivate young women today? Sandy, you want to start, and then we'll give Helen the last word.
Well, building on what we've just said, the stories are still out there. When I teach, I bring these kinds of projects into the classroom, and I encourage, with all the digital databases and manuscript archives now that are accessible, you can dig these people out and find brand new voices whose stories need to be told. And again, getting you back down to the Robbins house there in Concord, find out what you can online about Ellen Emerson and her African-American contingent of activists. These stories are begging for full-length biographies, for collective biographies, for editions of letters and journals. I mean, they're relevant, they're timely, and they're going to motivate a whole new generation of students in the classroom.
Great, thank you. Helen.
And from the point of view of life lessons, I think Caroline Dahl could teach us all a lot. She had awful things happen to her. She is frequently in the lowest depths of despondency, and she always makes it back up. And she knows that what she needs is what she calls, please God, give me some hard work to do. She says that will tax every muscle and strengthen all of my faculties. And sure enough, when she gets into some hard work to do, she bounces back.
Preparing for this conversation stretched my intellectual muscles, but I promise it was not hard work at all. It was a pleasure and a joy to read both of your books and to have this conversation with you. So we thank you for bringing these stories and your voices to Concord, and we hope to have you back again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank everyone again
you.
For joining. Remember, again, the dates are Laura Walls next Thursday, August 20th at 7, and Nicholas Basbanes speaking about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And again, there's a story, he focuses quite a bit of his biography on Longfellow's wife, Fanny Appleton, who is a fascinating character in her own right. And that event will be on Tuesday, August 25th. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you again, Sandy and Helen.
Thank you.
And good night, everyone.